So today we're going to explore dependent origination, and the sutta I'm going to be reading is Majjhima Nikaya 9, Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta. This is right view. Sammādiṭṭhi means right view. And this is going to explore each of the components of dependent origination, and we will go through it in the reverse order, so to speak, starting off with suffering, ending off with the ignorance and beyond, as we'll see. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Sammādiṭṭhi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There the Venerable Sāriputta addressed the bhikkhus thus, "Friends, bhikkhus." "Friend," they replied. The Venerable Sāriputta said this, "One of right view, one of right view is said, friends. In what way is a noble disciple one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" Indeed, friend, we would come from far away to learn from the Venerable Sāriputta the meaning of this statement. It would be good if the Venerable Sāriputta would explain the meaning of this statement. Having heard it from him, the bhikkhus will remember it. Then, friends, listen and attend closely to what I shall say. "Yes, friend," the bhikkhus replied. The Venerable Sāriputta said this. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the wholesome and the root of the unwholesome. Let me say that again. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the unwholesome and the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome and the root of the wholesome, in that way he is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what, friends, is the unwholesome? What is the root of the unwholesome? What is the wholesome? What is the root of the wholesome? Killing living beings is unwholesome. Taking what is not given is unwholesome. Misconduct in sensual pleasures is unwholesome. False speech is unwholesome. Malicious speech is unwholesome. Harsh speech is unwholesome. Gossip is unwholesome. Covetousness is unwholesome. Ill will is unwholesome. Wrong view is unwholesome. This is called the unwholesome. And what is the root of the unwholesome? Greed is a root of the unwholesome. Hate is a root of the unwholesome. Delusion is a root of the unwholesome. This is called the root of the unwholesome. So the unwholesome states of mind, which include, as Sāriputta listed, can be not following the precepts or breaking the precepts, ill will, cruelty, anger, jealousy, harsh speech, abusive speech, and so on and so forth. All of these are the actions that one produces, whether it's mentally, verbally, or physically. And these are rooted in a consciousness or a cognition that has already been tinged by the formations that have been rooted in these unwholesome states. So the roots of greed, hatred, and delusion arise at the point of formations. The formations are fettered by them. The formations are rooted in them, and therefore, when there is a reaction, when there is any kind of action or reaction to a situation, it will arise with the filtration process of either greed, hatred, or delusion, giving rise to these unwholesome states. So the more you act in an unwholesome manner, the more you are strengthening the formations that are rooted in those unwholesome roots. And what is the wholesome? Abstention from killing living beings is wholesome. Abstention from taking what is not given is wholesome. Abstention from misconduct in sensual pleasures is wholesome. Abstention from false speech is wholesome. Abstention from malicious speech is wholesome. Abstention from harsh speech is wholesome. Abstention from gossip is wholesome. Uncovetousness is wholesome. Non-ill will is wholesome. Right view is wholesome. This is called the wholesome. And what is the root of the wholesome? Non-greed is the root of the wholesome. Non-hate is a root of the wholesome. Non-delusion is a root of the wholesome. This is called the root of the wholesome. So wholesomeness is essentially maintaining one's precepts and having a mind imbued with loving kindness, imbued with compassion, imbued with empathetic joy, imbued with equanimity. The more you are able to be mindful of your mindset, which can be tainted either with the wholesome or the unwholesome. But regardless, if it's tainted with the unwholesome, the more you become aware just before you respond, or just before you continue that line of thinking, or just before you act physically, with that carefulness, with that heedfulness, with that mindfulness, you can stop the flow of the unwholesome. Using the 6 R's, which is the encapsulation of the eightfold path, you let go of the unwholesome and replace it with the wholesome. By doing so, you strengthen the formations that are rooted with the roots of the wholesome. That is to say, roots that are not enacting with greed, not enacting with hatred, not enacting with delusion. Therefore, you are essentially doing 2 things when you do that. You're weakening the unwholesome states of mind, weakening the formations that cause those unwholesome states of mind, which will then cause the unwholesome actions, and you're strengthening the wholesome formations, which give rise to wholesome states of mind, which give rise to wholesome actions. So what we are really doing is retraining the mind at the most subtle level, at the deepest level, which start with the formations. Well, there is a deeper level than that, but in terms of understanding formations, what we're saying is you pay attention to your intentions. If they are right intentions, they will be rooted in the wholesome. If they are wrong intentions, they will be rooted in the unwholesome. So it all starts with where your intention resides. When you become mindful of what those intentions are, and if they are wholesome, the only task there is to understand the emptiness aspect of that, meaning don't identify with the wholesome. But if you see that there is an unwholesome intention, use the 6 R's to let it go, replace it with a wholesome intention, thereby acting in a wholesome manner in mind, body, or speech. When a noble disciple has thus understood the wholesome and the unwholesome and the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome and the root of the unwholesome, when a noble disciple has thus understood the unwholesome and the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome and the root of the wholesome, he entirely abandons, now listen to this, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to lust. He abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion. He extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit, I am. And by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. He's going to repeat this over and over again, as you will see, but essentially he's talking about abandoning the underlying tendency to lust, that is the underlying tendency to craving. Underlying tendencies, as we will discuss later, underlie the feeling, underlie the quality of the experience. So if you have a wholesome, or let's say a pleasant feeling or pleasant experience, it can give rise to an underlying tendency in the mind to crave more of that pleasant feeling. If there is an unpleasant feeling, it can give rise to the underlying tendency to want to prevent that unpleasant feeling, and therefore the underlying tendency towards aversion. And whether it's the pleasant feeling, the unpleasant feeling, or the neutral feeling, identifying with that feeling, saying that this is my feeling, or I am this feeling, or this feeling belongs to me, or this feeling arises from myself, any of those things gives rise to the underlying tendency of, or the view towards the idea that I am. that there is an I am present. So it always starts at that level of feeling. But if you continue, as Sāriputta is saying, to strengthen the wholesome and weaken the unwholesome, your mind gets purified. Your mind immediately tends towards right view. And in doing so, that right view gives rise to right intention, and therefore that right intention gives rise to right speech, right action, right behavior, right livelihood, or right action or behavior and right livelihood through the process of 6 R's, which are right effort. The more you do this, the more the mind becomes further purified so that it's able to, as it says, extirpate the conceit of I am, the ability to see the arising of the idea of I am at that feeling. The moment your mind is sharp enough in its mindfulness to see that, it can let it go. Instead of acting from there and further strengthening that underlying tendency and therefore the fetter of conceit that is in the formations, in the sankharas, it will weaken it and ultimately completely destroy it because of its non-reaction from that underlying tendency. And we'll explore this more. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" "There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment. In that way, he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma." And what is nutriment? What is the origin of nutriment? What is the cessation of nutriment? What is the way leading to the cessation of nutriment? There are 4 kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the support of those about to come to be. What does that mean? That means there's nutriment for those who are already existing on this plane, who are already alive and so on. Of course, the being come to be, that is to say the infant or the fetus in the womb that is come to be. And even going beyond that, the being to come to be in terms of becoming a fetus, that also has nutriment. And that nutriment is physical food, depending upon where that being is, as nutriment, gross or subtle. So that could be, gross or subtle means there's gross food in the sense that physical food that one eats in the earth plane, or subtle food that is experienced by the devas and the brahmas. They subsist on joy, for example. They subsist on joy and sukha and so on. Contact as the second. So what that means is physical contact or mental contact through the 5 physical senses or through the mind as nutriment for feeling to arise, as nutriment for an experience to be experienced. You can only have that through the process of contact. Mental volition as the third. In other words, intention. So this intention drives forward the formations and gives rise to an action, gives rise to a process. We will talk about the formations later, but the intention can be a physical intention to move. It could be a mental intention to think and experience something, or it could be a verbal intention to speak. And it is through this intention that there is a process of continuance of this existence. That means not only in terms of on the momentary level, on a day-to-day level, but also on the micro level from one lifetime to the next. It's the intention, the last final intention that comes up right before the process of death, gives rise to certain formations which activate a certain type of consciousness that drives those formations into the next life. And that life will be obviously thematic, let's say, to the intention that was there in the previous life, giving rise to the next birth. And so intention is not just in day-to-day life, but intention in terms of what is your intention right before you die. And what that means is, if you have been unwholesome throughout your life, there will be a tendency for the mind to have unwholesome intentions, even unto the point of death. And therefore, the quality of that intention will give rise to a new life that is rooted in the unwholesome. And this is the process of karma. In the flip side of that, if one has been wholesome, it is difficult for an unwholesome intention to arise at the point of death, because the mind has been so trained and used to having wholesome formations arising. Then, if a mind, for example, is always in jhana, or has some sort of mastery in jhana, there will be certain formations rooted in that jhana, which can give rise to a mind that lets go and goes into that jhana, thus allowing the new consciousness to take birth in a Brahma realm that is associated with that jhana, and so on. Likewise with any of the ayatanas, and so on. So this is the process of intention that gives rise, or nutrifies, that is nutriment, nourishes an experience. And consciousness as the fourth. So consciousness here, in other words, you're not aware. If you don't have awareness, you won't have the experience. You need to have the contact, which gives rise to the awareness of the experience, which gives rise to the awareness, which gives rise to the actual experience itself. In other words, you have contact, and from that contact there arises the consciousness. From that consciousness there arises the experience itself, the feeling. On a macro level, consciousness is also understood to be the consciousness that arises at the last life, or the previous life in which the intention arose and the formations activate a certain type of consciousness, that then links to the next life. And so that next life is brought about with the descending of that consciousness into the womb. Let's say, just for simplicity's sake, in the human birth, gives rise to the womb, gives rise to a consciousness that descends into the womb, and therefore transfers those formations, those intentions, into the new being, into the nama-rupa that is then created and fed and nourished and kept alive in the womb for the next 9 to 10 months or whatever it might be. So this is another way of understanding that consciousness. Now, what's important to understand is, even during this process, the consciousnesses are fragmented. It's not the same consciousness at the end of one life that then gives rise to the new life. There is a carrier of the formations in the form of the death consciousness, which then transfers it to the new being, and that dissipates to give rise to a birth consciousness, which then continues to feed the formations, and that dissipates, and the consciousness arises and passes away in the womb, in that fetus. With the arising of craving, there is the arising of nutriment. In other words, craving is really what nourishes all of these things. Craving nourishes or gives rise to the nutriment of food. You have craving for food, or there is a bodily hunger. It gives rise to the want for food. You have contact, which can be infused with craving, the want to make contact through the 6 sense bases. The craving for intention. The intention can be infused with craving. Likewise, for example, when your intention is rooted in conceit, rooted in craving, rooted in ignorance, then that will give further rise to a nama-rupa, including the 6 sense bases, that are already tinged with that particular craving. And so the contact that arises is also tinged with the craving. And so whatever you see, whatever you experience in this reality is already tinged with that craving. And therefore, you're on the lookout of how to fulfill that craving. How do I get my fulfillment? How do I get my satisfaction? On the macro level, that craving arises in the form of, at the point of death, remorse or regret. Somebody has unwholesome states of mind. Or somebody has wholesome states of mind, and they see something lovely, or they remember a past memory while just before death, and they want it. They identify with it. This is the craving that pushes forward the new formations, or captivates the formations that activate the consciousness to give rise to the new rebirth. And likewise with the consciousness, it activates that consciousness to give rise to the new rebirth. So craving is the main thing to abandon in order to destroy rebirth altogether. It's craving, it's conceit, which is rooted in the craving, it's the aversion, it's the ignorance that give rise to further rebirth, as we'll see. When a noble disciple has, with the cessation of craving, there you go. With the cessation of craving, there is a cessation of nutriment. In other words, if you have let go of craving completely, that is why there is no rebirth for the arahant. There is no new consciousness that arises with the dissipation and dissolution of the five aggregates, because there are no formations arising at the point of death to which the arahant clings. They cannot cling because they no longer have the fuel for craving, the fuel for clinging, and therefore there won't be new rebirth. The way leading to the cessation of nutriment is just this noble eightfold path. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right collectedness. The way to understand this is the 6R process. As I've said before, the 6R process is the encapsulation of the eightfold path. It is because it is right effort. You use right effort to go from wrong view to right view, from wrong intention to right intention, from wrong speech to right speech, from wrong action to right action, from wrong livelihood to right livelihood, from wrong mindfulness to right mindfulness, and from wrong collectedness to right collectedness. So using the 6R process is vital in order for one to let go of craving and therefore experience the cessation of craving and thereby experience the cessation of suffering altogether. When a noble disciple has thus understood nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment, before I continue, what does that exactly mean? He has thus understood nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment. These are the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, as we understand, and it'll be in the next section, talks about suffering. But here, in place of suffering, it is nutriment. What is to be understood is the nutriment itself, the origin of the nutriment, which is the craving, the cessation of the nutriment, which is the cessation of the craving, and the way leading to the cessation of the nutriment, which is the Eightfold Path. So what Sāriputta is doing here is he's contextualizing each of these things using the Four Noble Truths, as an arahant would. You see, suffering is the basic formula that we understand when we talk about the Four Noble Truths. But as we'll see, he's also going to contextualize it with each of the links of dependent origination. This is the way in which the arahant views and understands the world, through the Four Noble Truths, through the lens of the Four Noble Truths. Seeing this is what it is, this is the way leading, this is what it is in the way of suffering or any other link. This is the origin of that process, of that link. This is the cessation, and always the 6 R's, or let's say the Eightfold Path, is the way leading out of the cessation of that link.
So there's a come up of let's say, a sense input, it's recognized and let go. I mean, but that's automatically done, so it just doesn't even...
It doesn't even register.
It doesn't even register.
Yes.
It's just...
That's why one was saying is that the arahant's mind tends to the cessation.
I'm with you.
Yeah. When a noble disciple has thus understood, as I said, understood nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to greed. He abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion. He extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit, I am. And by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. But here the bhikkhus are not satisfied. They want to ask him and saying, "Good friends," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. And they asked him a further question, "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. This is what is referred to as, we understand, the Four Noble Truths that is generally spoken of. That is to say, to understand suffering, to abandon the source of suffering or the cause of suffering, to realize and experience the cessation of suffering, and to cultivate the path leading to the cessation of suffering. This is the Four Noble Truths. And the way to see this is first to understand suffering, which Sāriputta is going to do. And once you understand suffering, then you backtrack. So in other words, you use yoniso manasikara. Manasikara, remember yesterday I said it was attention, but it also means to take to heart, to consider something. Yoniso comes from the root yoni, which means womb, or it can also mean the root or the source. So just as the Buddha was doing when he was meditating after his process of enlightenment, going through the process of dependent origination and reflecting, he was using yoniso manasikara to see what is the cause of the suffering, what is the cause of birth, what is the cause of bhava, what is the cause of clinging, and so on and so forth. And he came to these truths by using this yoniso manasikara. So in other words, it does dawn on the mind that this is the Four Noble Truths, but is also an active process in the mind. And one continues to exercise this until it becomes the default mode way of functioning, as it would for the arahant. Now let's explore what is suffering. And what is suffering? What is the origin of suffering? What is the cessation of suffering? What is the way leading to the cessation of suffering? Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. So in other words, birth in the sense of birth of action, that is the reaction that you have, is suffering. The birth in terms of physical birth, or the coming together, coming to be, let's say even in a deva realm or any other higher realm or lower realm, is suffering. Because with it comes all of the conditioned reality that can cause one to continue suffering through aging. I mean, aging is basically inevitable at this point in time. Aging, there's a lot of research going on with the idea of lengthening telomeres and things like that to prevent aging and whatnot. But that is only to a point. Aging in terms of the other aspect of that, which is sickness, disease. You have cancer, you have tumors, you have infectious diseases, you have diseases of the mind, you have mental conditions, you have physical conditions, you have pain, bodily pain, you have mental pain, which is the sorrow, the lamentation in the form of depression and anxiety and PTSD and all kinds of things that we understand today. These are all suffering. These are the inevitable facts of life, and it's important to understand suffering is present. But if you dwell on that, you are only going to lead further suffering for yourself. The point is to understand it and let go of the cause of it. So there might be a tendency for individuals to just dwell on the suffering and therefore not go beyond that and understand the second noble truth, the third noble truth, and the fourth noble truth. They just stay at the first noble truth and become further depressed, become further anxious. And so then the Buddha also, Sāriputta also says, not to obtain what one wants is suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates affected by clinging are suffering. This is called suffering. Not to obtain what one wants. In other words, you have a goal in mind. You don't achieve that goal. That is a form of suffering. You experience depression, or you experience sadness, or just a disheartened mental state because you didn't achieve what you wanted to achieve. But in the wanting to achieve that, there is the craving. There's already the inherent craving. Now, there are three types or three categories of suffering. There is dukkha dukkha, there is viparinama dukkha, and there is sankhara dukkha. The dukkha dukkha, which is interesting, it's basically the main suffering as we understand it, as it's just listed out here, the different kinds of suffering. The physical suffering, the mental suffering, and so on. The viparinama dukkha is the dukkha of things that change. It's the instability of life, the impermanence of life. You know, for example, you plan on going on a holiday and all of a sudden the weather changes and the flight is canceled. That's not in your control. That just arose because of causes and conditions. But you're suffering because of it. That is viparinama dukkha. You're enjoying a warm, shower and you're really enjoying it. Suddenly the hot water goes out and it's very cold. That's also a kind of suffering. That's the instability. That's the impermanence. That's the change or transformation that brings about suffering. So that's also not in your control. That's arising because of causes and conditions. The sankhara dukkha is a deeper level of dukkha. Sankhara, as we understand, means formations, and sankhara is essentially the conditioned reality. Anything that constructs, prepares, formulates, forms this idea of reality around you. And so all that you see in conditioned reality, all you experience in conditioned reality, has some kind of sense of unease, some sense of lack of satisfaction. Nothing fully satisfies. Nothing completely keeps you fully content. You may feel content for a little while, maybe for up to 7 days, maybe up to a month, but it will change. But this quality, this inherent quality of life is sankhara dukkha. And that is also categorized under the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. And how are the 5 aggregates affected by clinging? It is when there is an I am present with regards to each of the 5 aggregates. We'll explore that more. But essentially, any kind of suffering that you experience is conditioned reality. And all conditioned reality is experienced through one or more of the 5 aggregates. Bodily suffering is experienced through the rupa, through the body. Mental suffering is experienced through feeling and perception, through formations and through consciousness. And so there is inherent suffering in the 5 aggregates themselves, insofar as every time you see the 5 aggregates as self, or belonging to a self, or in self, or self in the 5 aggregates, there will be suffering. And what is the origin of suffering? It is craving, which brings renewal of being, is accompanied by delight and lust, and delights in this and that. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being, and craving for non-being. This is called the origin of suffering. So we're talking about craving here, and we're going to explore craving more in depth, but for now, suffice it to say that craving is basically this attitude of identification with the idea that I like this feeling because it's pleasant, or I hate this feeling because it's unpleasant, or this feeling is mine and therefore it belongs to a self. This is craving. At the very core of it, this is craving, and this can give rise to craving for sensual pleasures, give rise for craving for existence, and craving for non-existence, or in other words, bhavatanna or vibhavatanna. I'm going to talk more about that when we get to the link of craving, but ultimately it is craving, this identification, and through that identification, liking it or not liking it, that gives rise to the suffering. And what is the cessation of suffering? It is the remainderless fading away and ceasing, the giving up, relinquishing, letting go, and rejecting of that same craving. This is called the cessation of suffering. So when they say remainderless fading away and ceasing, what they're saying is there's not even one residue of suffering or residue of craving left. You have completely let it go. In the same way, as we'll get to formations, when the formations that are fettered by craving completely cease, completely are given up, relinquished, completely rejected, there is a remainderless fading away, which is to say, there is a fading away without a remainder, fading away without a residue. The formations are utterly purified, that not even one iota of craving exists in the arahant's mind. And what is the way leading to the cessation of suffering? It is just this, the Noble Eightfold Path, or as we say, the 6 R's. This is called the way leading to the cessation of suffering. When a noble disciple has thus understood suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. The other important element to understand is every time you use the 6R processes, whenever there is craving arising, whenever there's tension and tightness, that is a manifestation of craving or aversion, you are practicing the 4 Noble Truths, as I said day before yesterday. So in other words, you are in that moment experiencing a mini or nibbana in the relaxed step. When you relax, tranquilizing the formations, letting go of the cause of suffering, you are experiencing a miniature version of Nirodha, a miniature version of the cessation of suffering. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. So I just want to add one more thing, which is when you 6R, you are coming closer and closer to right view. You are activating right view in that moment. You see, there are 2 types of right view. There's the mundane right view and there's the supramundane right view. The mundane right view has to do with the understanding of ethics, the understanding of respect, the understanding of this world and the next, the understanding of karma and rebirth, to an extent. In other words, there are some components of that mundane right view. For example, understanding that there is the wholesome, understanding that there is the unwholesome, that your actions have consequences, that one should have reverence or gratitude for one's parents, even if one's parents were abusive, because at the very least, they brought you into this existence so that you could achieve nirvana, so you could achieve awakening. There is the understanding that there are certain teachers or recluses or ascetics who understand the Dhamma and therefore are able to teach. There is an understanding, or at the very least, an open-mindedness to accept that there is a possibility of other worlds, other realms, and the possibility of rebirth in those realms. So this is the mundane right view. The supramundane right view is the view, the lens in which the arahant views dependent origination, which we have been talking about all this time, is the 4 Noble Truths. When the mind completely understands suffering, completely abandons the cause of suffering, experiences the cessation, and has utilized and cultivated the way leading to that cessation, that mind has come to the supramundane right view, which is made up of the 4 Noble Truths. When, friends, a noble disciple understands aging and death, the origin of aging and death, the cessation of aging and death, and the way leading to the cessation of aging and death, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is aging and death? What is the origin of aging and death? What is the cessation of aging and death? And what is the way leading to the cessation of aging and death? The aging of beings in the various orders of beings, their old age, brokenness of teeth, grayness of hair, wrinkling of skin, decline of life, weakness of faculties, this is called aging. The passing of beings out of the various orders of beings, their passing away, dissolution, disappearance, dying, completion of time, dissolution of the aggregates, laying down of the body, this is called death. So this aging and this death are what is called aging and death. So that is, as we were talking earlier, aging is for the time being inevitable, but even that, when there are some modern scientific discoveries in prolonging the aging process or preventing the aging process, it will inevitably cause aging, and it will inevitably cause death. And aging can happen in different ways, not only in terms of physical aging, but there can be a decline, as was said, of the faculties, of the sensory faculties. There can be a decline of the mental faculties. There can be a decline in the way that one perceives reality through the six sense bases. But there's also another way to understand it, which is the attachment to that aging. A lot of people go through Botox and plastic surgery and get hair transplants and all kinds of things because they're afraid of looking their natural body, which is just aging. It's completely aged. What's the big deal, right? But there is a insecurity about it because they have identified with the body. They have made this body mine, or this body self, or they made the self in the body, or the body in self. And in doing so, in identifying with it, they have anxieties about it and insecurities about it. And to that extent also the death anxiety, which is what causes people to experience unwholesome states of mind. There's an understanding that the fear of death causes one further suffering by inflicting upon others suffering. In other words, there's an understanding of death anxiety from a psychological level, that those who are violent are afraid of violence itself. Those who are abusive are afraid of abuse itself. And therefore those who are afraid of death or inflict death upon others are also afraid of death. In other words, they kill so that they may remain alive. It's very subtle. It's a very subtle psychological mechanism in the mind, which is to say that they feel like they have power over death when they're able to inflict death over others. So this is the psychological understanding of that. But death is inevitable, whether it's in this realm, whether it's in the lower realms, or whether it's in the higher realms. There is a certain karmic fuel, and once that karmic fuel is exhausted, it will dissipate, and the aggregates will dissipate, and there will be renewal of being if there is craving, if there is intention rooted in craving, conceit, and ignorance. With the arising of birth, there is the arising of aging and death. With the cessation of birth, there is the cessation of aging and death. The way leading to the cessation of aging and death is just this noble eightfold path. So we're going to talk about birth next, but it makes sense. I mean, you have birth, whether it's physical birth, which can lead to aging, and that can be in the form of the infant growing into a toddler, the toddler growing into a child, the child into an adolescent, the adolescent into a full-grown adult, the full-grown adult into an older person, and then finally dying. And that whole process is brought about by the physical birth of the being into this world or any other realms. In that way too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" "There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands birth, the origin of birth, the cessation of birth, and the way leading to the cessation of birth. In that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma." And what is birth? What is the origin of birth? What is the cessation of birth? What is the way leading to the cessation of birth? The birth of beings in the various orders of beings, their coming to birth, precipitation in a womb, generation, manifestation of the aggregates, obtaining the basis for contact. This is called birth. So that's interesting. So In terms of, let's say, the macro level of birth, you have different ways that existence comes to be, different ways life comes to be. It can be through the process of coming into the womb, as it is with mammals. It can be through the process of coming through eggs, as it is with birds and certain insects or certain reptiles and things like that. Or it can come to be in what is known as moisture, which is an interesting term. So in other words, places where larvae can grow, and then there is an existence of those kinds of beings. And there's spontaneous generation, which happens in the lower realms, when there's the hell realms, the hungry ghost realms. But with the animals and the humans, there are these three categories of coming into being through eggs, womb, or moisture. In the higher realms, there's also spontaneous generation. So the process of birth is such that from the previous life, you had the formations activating a certain consciousness, giving rise to the consciousness that then transfers those formations to a new nama or a new nama-rupa, depending upon what kind of birth it is. When it comes to the birth in terms of in the womb or in the egg or moisture-born, the formations have a match to the genetic blueprint of that nama-rupa. So in other words, at that point of conception of that being, there is the formations that then connect with the genetic blueprint of that being, of that nama-rupa. And so it happens spontaneously. It doesn't take any kind of interval period. And this is called birth. This is the process of birth. When it comes to spontaneous generation, that is to say, whether it's in the hell realms, in the hungry ghost realms, or in the higher realms of the devas and the brahmas and so on, the karma, that is to say, the formations, then create a kind of rupa in the sensual realms, or a kind of rupa in the hell realms that is dependent upon the karma, intentions, and formations. And so even with regards to birth in the human realm, however you are born is dependent upon the previous formations that arose, dependent upon the intentions and the craving and the ignorance and so on. And so this is really the process of birth. And then the obtaining the basis for contact. So in other words, you have a certain kind of nervous system that is able to experience reality a certain way. It can only experience, for the time being, a certain level of spectrum within the electromagnetic spectrum. You can only see certain colors, you can only hear certain sounds, you can only taste certain things, you can only smell certain things, and so on, because of the way the nervous system is built. These are the bases for the contact, which is to say the sixth sense bases, the way information, the way sensory data is collected through the sixth sense bases. So in the same way, when the nama-rupa is created in the lower realms or in the higher realms or just the nama, well, specifically in the deva realms and the brahma realms, there's a specific kind of nervous system, so to speak. It's not necessarily the same kind of physical nervous system that we experience, but it's a subtle kind of, this is from this other traditions of subtle body, if you will, but it's the subtle nervous system which then gives rise to certain kinds of experiences. These are the basis for contact. These are their versions of, let's say, the sixth sense bases, if you will. With the arising of being, there is the arising of birth. With the cessation of being, there is the cessation of birth. The way leading to the cessation of birth is just this noble eightfold path. Now, before we continue into being, it's also important to understand that we talked just now about the macro level of birth. The micro level, that is to say on the day-to-day level, is the birth of action. There comes a point when you have a thought, you can't bring that thought back. There's a point that you say something, you can't take back what you said. There's a point that you make an action, you cannot take back that action. It is at this level of dependent origination that there is a threshold. And what I mean by that is, you can imagine dependent origination like a river. The very first links to dependent origination are the source of the river, whether it's some kind of rivulet or different kinds of water streams or glaciers or whatever. And then it starts to have certain whirlpools or vortexes, which are these links, these different links, especially craving, clinging, and being. And they continue to speed up the momentum of that river. And so what that means is, up until the level of feeling, if you're mindful enough, you can prevent craving. But it's more difficult to prevent clinging when you have craving. It's more difficult to prevent being when you have clinging. And it's definitely more difficult to prevent the birth of the action when you have being. But it is not preventable when the birth of action happens. And so that is when that waterfall in the river dependent origination arises. Now you can't climb back. Now when the birth is there, this is the waterfall which gives rise to that action, the mental, physical, or verbal action. When a noble disciple has thus understood birth, the origin of birth, the cessation of birth, and the way leading to the cessation of birth, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands being, this is bhava, or existence, or habitual tendencies, as it's sometimes known. The origin of being, the cessation of being, and the way leading to the cessation of being, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is being? What is the origin of being? What is the cessation of being? What is the way leading to the cessation of being? There are three kinds of being: sense sphere being, fine material being, and immaterial being. With the arising of clinging, there is the arising of being. With the cessation of clinging, there is the cessation of being. The way leading to the cessation of being is just this noble eightfold path, or the 6R process. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right collectedness. So being, bhava, is one of the more let's say, interesting links of dependent origination, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on. It's one of the larger vortexes or whirlpools that are going on in this river of dependent origination. Bhava is where the energy is fed back to the formations. So what that means is, if there is an intention, and that intention gives rise to those formations, and then that consciousness and so on, and lands at bhava, if at bhava, which is a storehouse of certain tendencies. What I mean by that is the storehouse of certain tendencies. That is to say, you might see reality in a certain way. You might have an idea of a person in a certain way. Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your sibling, maybe it's your father, maybe it's your mother, maybe it's your friend. You always have a tendency to look at them a certain way. And that tendency to look at them a certain way and act from there will strengthen and feed back the energy to the formations at the beginning, or relatively at the beginning. And the more you enact from this bhava, the more you enact from these tendencies, the more the storehouse gets larger with these tendencies, and the more it strengthens those formations. So there can be wholesome tendencies and there can be unwholesome tendencies. But bhava essentially can also give rise to a certain kind of, a certain kind of verbal action, a certain kind of mental action, a certain kind of physical action on the micro level. But on the macro level, as we said, there is the sense sphere realm, there is the fine material realm, and the immaterial realm. And what that means is, as we were talking about earlier, if there is a certain tendency that arises at the mind at the point of death, there is an activation of the storehouse of tendencies at bhava. From there, and this can come in the form of images and pictures and memories and words and verbalizations and all kinds of feelings and experiences at that point of death. When you have a near-death experience, for example, People have reported seeing certain things, certain beings, or reliving their entire life from beginning to end, so to speak. And this is part of the bhava process. When the person sees that and clings to it, then they enact from that bhava, which gives rise to a birth in one of these three levels of existence. And these three levels of existence, as we said, when you have the sensual realms, that is to say you have craving for a sensual experience, it will make you take rebirth in the sensual realm, whether that's the animal realm or whether that's the human realm or any of the lower realms or any of the six sensual heavens, for example. The fine material is related to what I call the luminous form. In other words, the jhana realms, the first four jhanas, and that is the first four levels of the Brahmas, the Brahma realms. And this happens when a mind is practicing the jhanas, whatever mastery or level of mastery you are at the jhanas, there is a tendency in that mind to then go into that jhana at death or just before death. And so the bhava that arises is rooted in the experience of that jhana. And therefore the formations that are experienced or activated because of this feedback loop, the activation of those tendencies feeds back the energy and activates the formations, which then carry forward the next consciousness into the next life. So if there's a jhanic mindset, if a mind is in jhana just before death, it will have a tendency to give rise to birth in a Brahma realm. Likewise, in the what is known as the formless realms, the immaterial realms, these are the arupa jhanas. This is to say a mind that is connected with infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, or neither perception nor non-perception. And so the tendencies that are the experiences of these realms activate a certain formation rooted in these realms or in these experiences that give rise to the next birth in those realms. So bhava is one of the most important elements to recognize in the form of your, well, not only viewpoints, but your tendency to act a certain way. There is sort of an automated process in which you act without thinking. The brain makes certain judgments or certain conclusions, shortcuts to conclusions, which can be prejudices, which can be predeterminations, which can be jumping to conclusions and so on. And this is that process of bhava. It's that shortcut where there is lack of mindfulness. And because of that lack of mindfulness, one just automatically acts from those tendencies. One automatically just acts from those habitual tendencies. And therefore, because they are impermanent, the habitual tendencies, it means they can be changed. If the unwholesome tendencies are there, if you have the mindfulness, you can recognize it and let go of those unwholesome tendencies, activate wholesome tendencies, and therefore feed energy back to the formations, which then strengthen wholesome formations, while at the same time weakening the unwholesome formations. When a noble disciple has thus understood being, the origin of being, the cessation of being, and the way leading to the cessation of being, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands clinging, the origin of clinging, the cessation of clinging, and the way leading to the cessation of clinging, in that way, he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is clinging? What is the origin of clinging? What is the cessation of clinging? What is the way leading to the cessation of clinging? There are these four kinds of clinging: clinging to sensual pleasures, clinging to views, clinging to rites and rituals, and rites and observances, and clinging to a doctrine of self. So let's really deeply explore these four kinds of clinging and understand what they are. So clinging is translated from upadana, and that is from upadi, which is to say assets in one way, or fuel. So it's the fuel for birth, it's the fuel for rebirth. And clinging to sensual pleasure starts from birth itself, physical birth itself. When the being is born, let's just simplify it to human birth for the sake of this discussion. They immediately take birth and whatever happens, and they have a sense of smell. They can identify the smell of the mother. They can identify the smell of nourishment in the form of breast milk or in the form of formula or any kind of nutrition for their body. And then they understand that the smell of the mother has a specific smell, and so they cling to that. The smell of the nutrition, the nourishment has a certain kind of smell, and so they cling to it. Through that clinging, they have already formulated an idea that this person is my protector. I want to be with this person, and it grows an attachment to the parent, to the mother specifically, but it can also be to the father, and so on. As the being grows up, when they become, let's say, a toddler or just before a toddler, they're introduced to new foods. So now we're talking about the realm of clinging to sensual pleasures. So for the sake of this understanding, now we are saying, now that the being is a toddler, and now they're introduced to new foods, but they have clung to that favorite of the breast milk or the formula or for the milk. And now you introduce fruits, you introduce mashed potatoes, you introduce soft foods for them to eat. What's going to happen? There is that weaning period where they hate that food because they have clung to the nutrition that they think is all what they need. And so now, after a little while, they start to eat the food and they start to develop certain taste for the food. They like only the white foods like mashed potatoes, but they hate the green food like broccoli. So they start to formulate ideas. They start to formulate favorites. This is another way of clinging. You start to formulate favorites. This is my favorite food, this is my favorite sound, this is my favorite piece of music, this is my favorite genre of music, this is my favorite film, this is my favorite color. When they go into kindergarten and first grade, they're asked, what is your favorite color? My favorite color is red because I like the way it looks. My favorite color is purple. So they're already starting to see what favorite things there are in terms of the sensory realms. As they start to grow, they're introduced to new foods, sugary foods, salty foods, spicy foods, and other kinds of things. And they start to develop new tastes. And so now they have relinquished the old for the new. The old clinging for the new clinging in the way of craving for these new kinds of things, new kinds of experiences through the sensory experiences. Perhaps later on, when they become teenagers, when they're in high school, they start to develop ideas about life. They start to develop mental concepts. And this is also part of sensory clinging because we're talking about the six senses, including thoughts, including the mind itself. They start to, of course, enter puberty, and so they have certain sexual attractions. They start to identify with certain genders, and so they cling to the idea that I only like these kinds of sexual experiences and not these kinds of sexual experiences. Doesn't matter what it is. But they develop these ideas, and they develop an identity based on that. So through that clinging, they identify with it, and that identity is stored in that storehouse of bhava. So bhava is also understood as identity, which is arisen from that process of ideation, from that process of choosing and picking what are my favorites, and picking and choosing what I will choose to cling to in the way of favorite foods and favorite tastes and favorite music and things like that. And so this continues on. And you see this in, let's say now, our so-called modern society, where a lot of the advertisements that we see on television or on YouTube or whatever it might be, or when you go to the supermarket, at least in America, there's a tendency when you go to the supermarkets and you have a little child with you, all of the sugary cereals are at the bottom, because they know that the child is going to look, because it's at eye level of the child. So they cling to those things. They use certain colors because they know it helps in terms of attracting the child's attention and so on. So they develop clinging to this. Wherever you go, you are bombarded by advertisements, and these advertisements are created to create the clinging, to create this identification, this idea that this is me, this is who I am. My name is so-and-so, and I love to take vacations, in the summer to the south of France because I love the weather, because it feels good to me. I'm so-and-so, and I like this kind of music because when I was a kid, I was with my dad and we had this experience, and now I've created this ideation, this idea that this is me, this is my identity. So these memories, these perceptions that are rooted in memories give rise to this clinging through the process of first craving and then further attaching to it the self, which is the clinging. On the flip side of that, there might be trauma. There might be other things that have been unwholesome in a person's life, and that can give rise to a certain type of clinging to sensual pleasures in the form of very strong aversion to it. So, for example, somebody's parent dies, and they're at the funeral, and there's somebody there who just rubs their shoulder to comfort them. But that feeling is associated with that experience of the death of the parent, the experience of the funeral of the parent. And later on in their life, they continue on with their life, and they have an infant, and they have their own child, and it's their first birthday party, and somebody comes up and rubs their shoulder. Immediately, because of that experience, they remember the funeral of their parent. And for that time, they're in that memory. And so that they have clung to that sensual experience, and have attached an emotion to it, have attached some kind of feeling to it, which they identify with. So trauma is a lot of clinging to that. And so with understanding this, one can start to disassociate through correct understanding, through correct means, and to be able to, let's say, retrain the mind from detaching these sensory associations with that trauma. This is one way of doing it. So sensual clinging, or clinging to sensual experiences, is done in this way. There is a selection. This process of selecting happens first with craving, which is to say, oh, I like this, or I don't like this, or I identify with this, and then further using the process of clinging to create the identity that is stored in the form of the tendencies that make up that identity in bhava. So it's like a snowball effect, right? So you have an experience, there's little snow, it starts to the craving starts to build up the snow, the clinging starts to amass that snowball, and then ultimately it becomes one giant snowball, and in the form of identity at bhava. Then we have the clinging to views. Yeah, this is interesting. So the clinging to views is basically essentially clinging to wrong views. But before we explore that, let's also understand clinging to views in general. That is to say that whether it's a political view, a religious view, a societal view, an economic view, geopolitical view, whatever you want to call it, there's a tendency nowadays for people to hold on to certain views. They identify as being conservative, they identify as being liberal, they identify as being a fan of this particular sports team, and therefore I love this sports team and this is my favorite sports team, and everybody else can go to hell, right? So this causes an experience of suffering for the mind. People become so attached to these views that they experience what is known as confirmation bias. In other words, they will only hear what other members of their favorite sports team's fans will want to talk about. As soon as you bring in somebody from the outside, they don't want to hear anything. They close it off. They will only confirm what are complementary to their own views. This is confirmation bias. Then you have cognitive dissonance, where somebody actually gives you correct information, but because you are so attached to whatever view you have, it's difficult for the mind to process it, and more often than not, it will just let that go because they are so attached to that particular view. But more specifically, within the context of the Dhamma, we are talking about wrong view. And there are 62 different types of wrong view that are mentioned in the Digha Nikaya. That's Digha Nikaya number 1, Brahmajala Sutta. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through each of the 62 views. That'll take a long time. Well, I'm actually planning to do only 6, and I'll tell you the 6 main views. But these can be encapsulated into 2 views specifically. That is eternalism and annihilationism. The idea that the self is eternal, or the idea that the self is not eternal, and therefore it's basically nihilism, annihilationism, that there doesn't exist anything afterwards. And then this can give rise to a whole host of views. But the 6 types of views that I want to talk about have to do with karma, have to do with rebirth, and have to do with the idea of self, the universe, existence, and so on. And let's hope I remember them correctly. So let's go to them slowly. So each of these 6 views were related to the type of ascetics that were there during the Buddha's time. So the first view was amoralism, not immoralism or moralism, amoralism, which is to say, it doesn't make a difference what you do in this world. You don't need to be ethical. You don't need to be moralistic. There's no cause and consequence. It's just whatever it is, and this gives rise to the view, then that means I can just be however I want to be, and I don't have to care about the consequences of my actions. But as we see and as we understand, that is not the case. So amoralism will say that, well, I can kill a person and there won't be consequences for that. I can steal and there won't be consequences for that, and so on and so forth. But as we understand, if you kill a person, you get caught. If you do get caught, if you don't get caught, you're eaten up by the guilt of killing that person. So there's still a consequence, a mental consequence of that action in some way. Or whatever other crime you commit or whatever else you might do, there is still a reaction to that. There is still a consequence to that. And so this is in direct, let's say, violation of the understanding of karma, of action and reaction, of cause and consequence. The second view is of the ajivikas, which is also known as niyati-vada. And niyati-vada means view or school of thought, let's say. And niyati means fate or destiny. So predeterminism, fatalism. Everything is already predetermined, so why do I have to make an effort to do anything, right? I don't have a choice in this whole process. Even my whole attainment of arahantship is already predestined. So why do I need to make any kind of effort? My suffering is predestined. The causes of my suffering are predestined. And therefore the cessation also is predestined. I can just continue on without any intention. I can continue on like a puppet of the universe, a puppet of some kind of puppet master. Now it's interesting that the person who held this view at that time, of the ajivikas, was somebody who ultimately went mad. He went crazy and he drowned himself in the river. Because upholding that view causes you to say, then what's the point of this life? If everything is already predetermined, why do I have to make an action to be ethical? Why do I have to make an action to go into samadhi? Why do I have to make an action to gain insight? It'll happen anyway. But as you've seen or as you understand through the process of karma, that is not the case. There is an intention, and based on that intention, there is an action, and based on that action, at some point or another, whether it's in the next moment or whether it's in the next lifetime, there is a consequence of that action. And so that is why sila brings about samadhi, and samadhi brings about panya, but all of those are running with the thread of effort, with the thread that my intention can change the consequences. That's why at a certain point you can see the different karmic streams, but these karmic streams you see maybe in your past lives that certain choices led you to a certain decision, which led you to a certain circumstance, which led you to another choice, which led you to this present moment. If you see into the future, you can see if I take this choice, it will lead me to this consequence. If I take this choice, it will lead me to that consequence. So the idea of free will comes into play then. Here, predeterminism says that there is no free will. But within the Dhamma also, the idea of free will would mean that there is an independent, all-abiding self outside of the parameters of cause and effect. But everything that is conditioned by cause and effect. And therefore, every intention is conditioned by a previous set of intentions. Every action conditions the next set of choices. By seeing this, you understand that yes, there is a certain level of will, but that will is conditioned by your previous set of circumstances, which are conditioned by your previous set of choices. So this is how one can take the understanding of free will, which is actually really a conditioned free will. You have a choice, but you have a choice in that moment as something is arising, whether to hold on to it and act in an unwholesome manner, or to let it go and act in a wholesome manner.
Sorry, in the Kabbalah, God is your, the creator, blah blah blah. And then there's this question of, well, does God decide or do you decide? In these conventional ways here. And then they're saying a being created has a choice between 51% and 94%. And that choice of 1% difference is towards the good or the bad.
Yeah.
So you can't decide all good or, but that's for God,
Right.
say, or the creator, or the creative force, or whatever you want to call it. But the slight distinction between the wholesome and unwholesome, that slight nudge to change the balance, that's exactly your option.
Right.
And it sounds very similar. Very similar.
Yeah.
Sorry for...
No, that's okay. That's okay.
So, since you're interrupted, I'm going to I think dependent origination means determinism. Nevertheless, there is free will, and philosophers have said that it can be compatible. And the Dhamma way of making them compatible, there is free will, but it's not ours.
Exactly. The free will is in that moment of the choice that you make. But I will go as far as to say and expand that and say that choice itself is conditioned by previous choices because of the momentum of like-minded choices, if you will, or similar thematic choices, if you will. But in that moment, you can decide, well, I choose not to be wholesome. I choose not to be unwholesome. I have used my mindfulness to say I'm letting go of that and I'm changing it in this direction. And hence the understanding of weakening certain formations and strengthening other formations. This is that process of the understanding of karma, actually. Intention being the onset of karmic actions, whether it's in mind, body, or speech. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's very fine.
All right. So that is the second view. The third view is materialism. That is to say, it's a view of, well, it can be understood in some ways as moral nihilism. That is to say, it's very similar to amoralism, except the whole point of life is to eat, drink, and be merry. That's the materialistic view. And so it's all about attachment to the senses, gratifying the senses. Do what you can to gratify the senses, even if you have to kill somebody, rob somebody, whatever it is. And so we see how it is in direct violation of the Dhamma because it violates ethics. There's actually an understanding of this in ancient India when this sect was present. And in that time, ghee, if you know ghee, which is clarified butter, was a luxurious item, an item of luxury. And it was said, in this view, eat as much ghee as you can, eat the finest foods and wear the finest clothes and do whatever you can, even if you have to take loans to do so. Now that sounds very similar to what we know as modern advanced capitalism. So, but this view leads to anxiety ultimately. Because in trying to fulfill the senses, you ultimately have, you do come to an existential crisis at one point or another and say, is that all there is? Eat, drink, and be merry, that's it? I mean, then what's the point of life? Like, I can have my fill, and you realize that that's also impermanent. Like, I am only satisfied to a certain extent. My body can only hold so much food. I can only wear so many clothes. I can only have so much money in the bank, and so on and so forth. I can only have so many Rolls Royces, and so many mansions and things like that. I can't enjoy all of them all at the same time. So you are limited by these things. And so you realize that there is something more. And that something more is the understanding of the Dhamma through the process of samadhi. When you experience the pleasurable feeling of jhanas, the mind ultimately lets go of attachments and identification to material things. Because the finer pleasures of jhana are something beyond the scope of sensory experiences. That's why in the first jhana, you are secluded from sensual pleasures, and the mind experiences a higher level of pleasant feeling, something that is more exquisite than the satisfaction you get from driving a Rolls Royce or eating the finest foods or having a lot of money in the bank. I mean, these things are good. There's nothing wrong with them, but ultimately they are impermanent, and they are not satisfying, and therefore they are not self. So this view of materialism can, as we see in modern day as well, can bring about a lot of anxiety, a lot of restlessness, a lot of depression, a lot of existential crises, and therefore it might be a good thing insofar as bringing about suffering, then bringing about samvega to get into the journey of the Dhamma, but that's only dependent upon a person's choice. So that's the third clinging of the view. The fourth clinging of the view is something known as eternalism in one way, and in another way it's known as atomism. And what that is to say is that everything is made up. There are seven qualities of existence. That is to say, the four elements, the pain, the pleasure, and the self. And these are all permanent. They have the illusion of being impermanent. So this is a very distorted view away from the Dhamma, which is to say the Dhamma says everything is conditioned and everything that is conditioned is therefore impermanent. But this view says that everything is eternal, and at the same time it's made up of certain components, which are the atoms. And so according to this view, in one of the ascetics says about this view is, you can cut off somebody's head, but you're not actually cutting off their head. Even though it appears to be that you're cutting off their head, they're still alive because the self or the soul is permanent. The soul is eternal. Therefore, it justifies the process of killing. You're not affecting anybody really, because there's just a soul that is always permanent. It's never going to be harmed. It's never going to be harmed by fire, water, earth, and so on. And so this view causes people to go into sometimes immoral ways, and also clings to the self, clings to the idea of a self that is permanent. And this leads to further suffering as well, further confusion. The fifth view is the view of the Niganthas, as they are known in the suttas, but they are what are known as modern day Jainism. And Jainism believes in an eternal self and all kinds of things related to karma and rebirth. But aside from all of those other aspects, the main thing about Jainism is that the idea of karma is particles, okay? And as a person or a soul reincarnates from one lifetime to a next lifetime, whether they intend an action or not. In other words, let's say you're walking on the grass and you accidentally stomp on an earthworm. They say that even that accidental stomping on the earthworm is your fault. And therefore, there was, even whether you had an intention or no intention, there is a karmic residue, a karmic particle that attaches itself to the soul. And these karmic particles then determine the next arising of that soul in a new lifetime, and so on and so forth. But the way out of this, according to this view, is through asceticism. In other words, it's through restraint. Now, even in Buddhism, there is sense restraint, but they take this to the extreme through practices of austerities. There's a process called salekana, where they fast unto death. And the belief in that is, in that process of fasting, you are purifying the bodily karma, you're purifying the verbal karma, and you're purifying the mental karma. And the Buddha had a question about that when somebody was telling him about their view about this Jainism. And he said, so how do you know exactly how much karma is left and how much karma is dissipated? And they didn't really have an answer for that. The idea is, well, we just know that if we do this, where we are dissipating the karmic particles, and ultimately then we will get to the final liberation, or however they see their cosmological worldview. But ultimately what it is saying is that the experience of karma can only be restrained. It can only be understood through the processes of purifying the karma through certain actions, through certain practices. And what happens with this view is you begin to identify with those practices. So actually, you're not really just, if you are dissipating, who knows, but you're actually identifying with those processes to create more karma for yourself, creating certain formations rooted in those purification processes. And then the cycle just continues on and on and on and on. So how does one let go of that? So there is a sutta in which Ananda is asked a question about the nigantas, and it says that nigantas, by purifying through certain purification processes, through certain austere practices, they are able to let go of karma. They are able to cease karma. But Ananda says, actually, it is through the process of ethics, through the process of sila, that I purify my mind. It's not through certain kinds of rituals and ceremonies and austere practices that I purify my mind. It's through not killing. It's through not stealing. It's through not having sensual misconduct, not through lying, and not through attaching to, or indulging rather, in intoxicants and so on. Therefore, because of ethics, because of sila, my mind is purified. And then through that process, my view is purified through samadhi. And then ultimately, I understand the process of rebirth and karma, and my insight, or the insight, purifies completely the karma. In other words, what he's saying, he understands it in a practical manner, where he says, when there's contact, there's a feeling. And that feeling is karmic in nature because it arose because of past choices. And so the present experiences that you're having is the consequences of your past intentions. For example, right now, you are all listening to me because you made a conscious decision and intention to come to this retreat. And so your intention is now brought to fruition by this whole meeting that we're gathered at. So what he says in that sutta is, it is through correct understanding of the impersonal nature, the impermanent and impersonal nature. In essence, the three characteristics, having been seen through that feeling, one does not react to that feeling by identifying, by craving, or by clinging. And therefore, karma is dissipated. It might not dissipate right away. There might be still some repercussions that will be experienced at another moment in time. But because I don't identify with that feeling, because I don't crave to it, I don't cling to it, I weaken, through my non-reaction, I weaken that karma. But if I were to crave, I add to that karma. And therefore that karma is added through those reactions. And therefore my intentions are also rooted in that karma, and so on. So what he's basically saying is, because I don't identify, because I don't react in that moment to that feeling, the underlying tendencies don't arise. And since the underlying tendencies don't arise, there is no craving. Since there is no craving, there is no clinging. Since there is no clinging, there is no being. And therefore there is no renewed birth of action. And therefore on a macro level, there is no renewal of being and a new rebirth. And so the Dhamma understanding of karma is in this way. The way leading to the cessation of karma is essentially the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is encapsulated in the 6 R's. The moment you see the underlying tendency of craving arising, you 6R it, and you no longer add to the karmic fuel, and rather it continues to dissipate. by whatever experiences you'll have. So it's not through purification, it's not through fasting, it's not through, doing all these really interesting but ultimately strange austerities that people used to do while as, forced ascetics that leads to the dissipation of karma. It is the cultivation of the mind through sila, samadhi, and panya. And in doing so, with that insight into the three characteristics of feeling, one does not hold on to the feeling, and because one does not hold on to it, there is no further fuel for further rebirth and renewal of karma. This is the way to understand it, to let go of that feeling of that wrong view of saying that we need austerities and rituals. So that was the fifth view. The sixth view is what is known in Pali as anyana. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, which Sāriputta was actually part of before he joined the Dhamma, before he became a monastic under the Buddha's dispensation, he and Moggallana. And this was a view held by a person named Sanjaya. And this view says, and they were known, by the way, as eel wrigglers. Why? Because they didn't conclude on anything. They said, oh, well, it could be or it could not be. There might be a view, there might not be a view, there might be karma, there might not be karma, who knows? But the reason why they had this kind of view, let's say, which is this idea of skepticism in one way, is because they were afraid of concluding onto something and then having to defend that view. So they had anxieties about that. In one way, that was, historically speaking, that was the reason why they held this view. Secondly, they just couldn't conclude. They just didn't have an idea that there is a self or there is no self, there is a birth or there is no birth, there is a Tathagat or there is no Tathagat, there is, right view or there is no right view. And this directly is in violation of the Dhamma, because the Dhamma's foundation is right view. First, the mundane right view, as we talked about, and then finally the supramundane right view. So the way leading to the cessation of clinging to this particular view is to become a Sotapanna. Well, before that, have the conviction in right view, and then the Sotapanna attainment will confirm for you that this is the right view, and you won't have this view, and in fact you won't have any of the other wrong views because you have seen it for yourself. Finally, I want to talk about the clinging to the Dhamma itself, because that can become a view as well. That can be, which is what the Anagami has to deal with. And the Sutta Nipata, there are sections in the Sutta Nipata which talk about going from wrong view to right view to no views at all. Now that's a very subtle thing to say, because it doesn't mean that a person doesn't hold on to any views like there would be in the case of the sixth wrong view. Rather, what it's saying is, I understand what right view is, or my mind has come to right view, but I understand that right view also is of the nature of impermanence, is of the nature of suffering, is of the nature of anatta. I understand that that right view is not me, not mine, not myself. And by doing so, one doesn't have any need to defend the Dhamma. Truly, the Dhamma will speak for itself. There's no need to be an apostle, so to speak, of the Dhamma, to go out preaching about the Dhamma and being attached to it in that way. The Dhamma will speak for itself through your own actions, through your own speech, and through your own mental actions. So people will see a change in you and want to ask you what's going on, and you can see that as an invitation to tell them this is what it is, and if they have further interest, you can talk about the Dhamma if you think it's appropriate. But the clinging to the Dhamma is just like that analogy of the raft. You come to the other shore, and now that is the Dhamma. That is the eightfold path leading you to the other shore. Now you are on the other shore, you're going to carry the raft on your back, and you're going to continue walking. That doesn't make any sense at all. So the attachment to the Dhamma is arisen because of a pride, because of a conceit in obtaining the Dhamma, in attaining the Dhamma. And this is that conceit that the Anagami has to let go of in the 5 higher fetters. So letting go of any attachment to the Dhamma itself happens when one becomes an arahant, or has that understanding. And so when they say no views, it doesn't mean that you don't hold on to any view. It just means you understand that view itself is not self also. That view is of the nature of anatta. All right, let's move on. The clinging to rules and observances. So this is also known as Silabbata Upadana, which is to say sila, which is the ethics, and abata, which is vows. Clinging to certain rites and rituals, basically, with the belief that they will lead you to nibbana. But there's a deeper understanding of this clinging to rites and rituals. Number one, there's the understanding that certain things that you do, in the sense of carrying around with you a lucky charm, or carrying around with you something that somebody says will change your fortune. And so you cling to that idea that if I carry this 4-leaf clover, if I carry around this horseshoe, if I carry around this rabbit's foot, or if I just do this particular ritual, it's going to change my karma and I will have luck and fortune. I'll have a lot of riches and I'll have a good life and all of these other things. But that's in direct violation about the law of karma, which is to say it is your efforts, your wholesome efforts that lead you to wholesome consequences. So that is one type of clinging to rites and rituals. The second type, well, that also includes things like astrology and palmistry and looking into, tea leaves and palm leaves and figuring out who you were in a past life out of curiosity, and therefore understanding this is going to be my future life and all these other things, because that creates the idea of self there as well. So that's why the Buddha talked about wrong livelihood, where he said the monks ought not to do any kind of wrong livelihood that relates to reading signs in the sky, reading bird droppings, reading, what's going on with the weather and all kinds of things like that. And so that is in direct violation of the idea that, okay, I don't really have a choice in this. If I just do this ritual, do this particular fire sacrifice or something, I'm going to change my fortune. I'm going to change my destiny. That's a direct violation. Another kind of clinging to rules and rituals is identifying with pride at maintaining the precepts. So we talk about sila, for example. It is good, obviously, to have a commitment to maintaining your precepts, a commitment to taking them every day and committing to them. But identifying with them and causing yourself to see them as the end itself, rather than seeing this as a means towards nibbana. And therefore there's a pride that can arise because of being, that's self-righteousness, in other words. And so that is another type of clinging to rites and rituals. There was a video that I saw about the Silabbata Upadana, and it's a little joke that Bhante Sujato had about it. And he said Sila means the foundation, the rock. And Bata means roll. So Silabbata Upadana is clinging to rock and roll. But essentially this is what Silabbata Upadana is, clinging to rites and rituals. It's to simplify it, the main point is identifying with processes, whether it's through chanting or doing certain kinds of rituals within Buddhism, with the idea that they will take you to Nibbana. And so that's why when you become a Sotapanna and you actually walk the entire path, that's why you destroy the fetter of the belief in rites and rituals, the attachment to rites and rituals with the belief that it will take you to Nibbana. And then finally, the clinging to a doctrine of self. There are 20 types of views related to this. I'm going to simplify it for you, don't worry. This is in relation to the 5 aggregates. So the 4 views times the 5 aggregates, multiplied by the 5 aggregates, leads to the 20 different types of view. In other words, the 4 main types of views related to the self is the 5 aggregates as self. In other words, the body or form, feeling, perception, formations, or consciousness as self. The self within the 5 aggregates, that is to say, there is a self in form, a self in feeling, a self in perception, a self in formations, or a self in consciousness. There is the idea that the 5 aggregates belong to a self, that the self is the owner of the 5 aggregates. And so there is a self that owns the form, there's a self that owns the feeling, there's a self that owns the perception, there's a self that owns the formations, and there's a self that is that owns the consciousness. The 4th view is the idea of the aggregates within a self. This is different from belonging to a self. In other words, there's an overarching self within which these 5 aggregates function. So the aggregates are within that particular self. So this is related to certain kind of Brahmanical views that we were talking about earlier, which is that Atman and Brahman, the individual self and existence, or the universe, or the substratum of self. The aggregates as self is already refuted when you see the impermanent nature of the aggregates. Because first, we have to understand, what does it mean when they say self? According to the Indic understanding, it is to say that the self is permanent, all-abiding, that the self is beyond the scope of cause and effect, so therefore beyond the scope of conditionality, and that the self is independent. It is autonomous and eternal and never-ending. But as we understand, we know that the aggregates are impermanent, and therefore they cannot be considered to be self. The idea that the self exists in one or more of the aggregates would mean that only when the arising of a form, only when there is an arising of a feeling, is there an arising of the self. But that completely is in violation of the idea of what a permanent self is as well. So you cannot accept those sets of self-doctrines either. The idea that there is a self that is the owner of the aggregates, or the idea that there is a self that is outside of the scope of the aggregates, and so the aggregates are within the self, is the idea of the Brahman. That is to say that the Atman is the individual self. One of the images they use is like a pot of water, and that water inside that pot is the self, considered to be the self. And it's floating on the ocean, and the ocean is the Brahman. The ocean is the universe. Cracking the pot, it means that it becomes one and the same thing. So the idea that the self is the owner of the aggregates, or the idea that the self is outside of the scope of the aggregates, and therefore the aggregates are functioning within the self, is related to this particular set of views. But what we have to understand is the awareness of a self is dependent upon consciousness itself, which is dependent upon mentality-materiality. So in other words, this self is just a concept that arises in the form of a thought, or in the form of an experience that is induced by that thought, and therefore when you let go of that thought, or you forget about that thought, so goes the self, so goes the idea of the self. This is the way to understand that this is also a wrong doctrine of self. So those are the 4 types of clinging. Let's continue. With the arising of craving, there is the arising of clinging. With the cessation of craving, there is the cessation of clinging. The way leading to the cessation of clinging is just this noble eightfold path. That is, as we said, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right collectedness. When a noble disciple has thus understood clinging, the origin of clinging, the cessation of clinging, and the way leading to the cessation of clinging, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" "There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands craving, the origin of craving, the cessation of craving, and the way leading to the cessation of craving, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this Dhamma, at this true Dhamma." And what is craving? What is the origin of craving? What is the cessation of craving? What is the way leading to the cessation of craving? There are these 6 classes of craving: craving for forms, craving for sounds, craving for odors, craving for flavors, craving for tangibles, craving for mind objects. With the arising of feeling, there is the arising of craving. With the cessation of feeling, there is the cessation of craving. There is a cessation of craving. With the cessation of feeling, there is a cessation of craving. The way leading to the cessation of craving is just this noble eightfold path. So craving. Craving is also not only in the context of, as we said, sensual craving through the 6 sense bases, but also existential craving. That is to say, the bhava tanna and the vibhava tanna. So the sensual craving arises when there is some kind of sensory experience and the mind immediately identifies with it and says, "I like this," or "I don't like this." So craving has the umbrella of liking and aversion. It's not just craving in terms of liking it, but it can also be not liking it in the form of aversion. The bhava tanna is that kind of tanna that is related to wanting to become something. So I want to be a millionaire. I want to be a good meditator. I want to be an arahant. I want off of this wheel of samsara. This is all bhava tanna. Well, vibhava tanna also, because you want the wheel off of the wheel of samsara, but we'll get into that later. Bhava tanna is also related to clinging to the jhanas, identifying with the jhanas. I really want this experience of the jhanas and I really like it, so I identify with it. I don't want to go beyond it. I really like this state right now. That prevents you from going further, and that is also bhava tanna. Vibhava tanna is the craving for non-existence. That is to say, people might become overwhelmed with life circumstances and they just don't want any more to do with it. And this causes them to commit suicide, unfortunately. And this can result from the vibhava tanna, the craving for no longer being in these set of circumstances. So it's rooted in aversion. I don't like being here anymore. I don't like the kind of family I'm with, or I don't like being in this school, or this is getting too much. I'm being bombarded by all of these sensory experiences, or I don't have the financial means to do this or that, so I want to end my life. I don't want any more of this existence. This is vibhava tanna. On a more micro level, it's also related to the jhanas. The idea that if you've gone to a higher state and you go to a lower state, let's say you're in infinite consciousness, now you want to go to 4th jhana, you have aversion to those factors of the jhana. And that's the idea that I don't want to be in that jhana. That is the vibhava tanna. That is the idea that I don't like it here, I don't want to be here, I don't want to become this, I never wanted to be here. So these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of ideas are manifestations of the bhava tanna and the vibhava tanna. As I said, the sensual craving is essentially the craving for things that arise in the way of the six sense bases. And as we understand it from the twin perspective, the manifestation of craving is an unease in the form of a tension in the mind and or body. So if you see that there is like a holding on to, it's a very subtle thing, but it happens when there's a push and pull of the mind in relation to the feeling or the experience. The mind either gravitates towards it, and therefore there's a tension around that, or it doesn't want it or identifies with it, and there's a tension around that. That physical tension can come in the form of actual muscular tension or tension in the head, or it can come in the form of other kinds of, let's say, a fast heart rate or fast respiration rate and other kinds of manifestations. But for simplicity's sake, if you notice tension, then you understand there is craving. And hence, within the 6R process, the important emphasis on relaxing, tranquilizing the tension, releasing the actual physical tension as a manifestation of craving. In other words, when you use the 6R process, you understand there's suffering, you understand there's craving that's causing the suffering, you will let go through the relaxation and therefore experience the mini nibbana, which is the nirodha, the cessation of suffering, using the 6 R's as the fourth noble truth. When a noble disciple has thus understood craving, the origin of craving, the cessation of craving, and the way leading to the cessation of craving, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When friends, a noble disciple understands feeling, the origin of feeling, the cessation of feeling, the way leading to the cessation of feeling. In that way, he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is feeling? What is the origin of feeling? What is the cessation of feeling? What is the way leading to the cessation of feeling? There are these 6 classes of feeling. Feeling born of eye contact, feeling born of ear contact, feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, feeling born of mind contact. With the arising of contact, there is the arising of feeling. With the cessation of contact, there is the cessation of feeling. The way leading to the cessation of feeling is just this noble eightfold path. So, feeling is dependent upon contact. Contact, as we will see, is the conjoining of the outer sense base and the inner sense base. In other words, the form or colors and the eye, the sound and the ear, the odor and the nose, the taste and the tongue, the tangibles and the body, and the thoughts and the mind. Feeling has certain underlying tendencies. So if at the level of feeling there is a lack of mindfulness, there is a lack of clarity, there is a lack of awareness, there is a lack of heedfulness, craving can arise. And it can arise because there is a certain kind of reaction to the feeling. When a person sees a pleasant feeling, there can be the underlying tendency of craving to arise. And because one reacts to that underlying tendency, it can give rise to craving, the link of craving. If there is an unpleasant feeling, it can give rise to an underlying tendency of aversion, and the person sees that as mine and therefore reacts to it, and it can give rise to aversion in the link of craving. If there is the underlying tendency of views in relation to, or underlying tendency towards views in relation to this is this is this particular experience and therefore I like it and so on, this can also give rise to the next link of craving. If there is an underlying tendency towards the conceit that this is mine, this I am, this is myself, that too can give rise to the level of the link of craving. If there is the underlying tendency towards ignorance, that is to say that one doesn't understand or has lack of mindfulness, that is the lack of the awareness of the Four Noble Truths, the lack of the awareness of the impermanent nature, the suffering aspect, and the anatta nature of the feeling, that can give rise to further craving from that feeling. So I think I went through 6 of the 7. The underlying tendency towards craving, the underlying tendency towards aversion, the underlying tendency towards views, the underlying tendency towards conceit, the underlying tendency towards ignorance, and I think there was the underlying tendency towards doubt. So that comes in the form of doubt about the practice, for example, or doubt about the actual path, and so on. So this can arise in the form of doubting the 3 characteristics or misperceiving the nature of that feeling. In other words, having a distorted perception, seeing the permanent in the impermanence, the satisfying in the unsatisfying, and the self in the not self. Was that 7? Let's count again.
No, I just like your last summary.
Yeah. Good. So that is how the feeling becomes craving, through those underlying tendencies. And how do you let go of those underlying tendencies? By not reacting, by being mindful. Every time you have mindfulness, it is the gatekeeper that takes away those underlying tendencies and weakens them. But if you react, you have a reaction to them, then it feeds energy back to the formations. It feeds energy back to ignorance. It feeds energy back to the taints. It feeds energy back to the formations, which then activate a certain form consciousness, which then envelops that nama-rupa or conditions that nama-rupa, and therefore conditions the sixth sense space, and therefore conditions the contact, and continues to strengthen that particular underlying feeling or underlying tendency in that feeling. So these are the mini feedback loops that I was talking about, from bhava to formations, from clinging to formations, from craving to formations. All of these continue to strengthen certain formations or weaken certain formations. When a noble disciple has thus understood feeling, the origin of feeling, the cessation of feeling, and the way leading to the cessation of feeling, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view?" They're very unsatisfied. They really want to get to the core. And has arrived at this true Dhamma. There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands contact, the origin of contact, the cessation of contact, and the way leading to the cessation of contact, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is contact? What is the origin of contact? What is the cessation of contact? What is the way leading to the cessation of contact? There are these 6 classes of contact: eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, mind contact. With the arising of the sixfold base, there is the arising of contact. With the cessation of the sixfold base, there is the cessation of contact. The way leading to the cessation of contact is just this noble eightfold path. So contact. So another thing to understand is, up until the level of feeling, so feeling is just that bare sensation, that is the bare experience. The quality of the feeling, the pleasant, the unpleasant, or neutral, is the beginning of perception. Then adding on to it, the recognition of what kind of experience that is further perception. Now, everything up until this point is what is known as old karma. Craving onwards is new karma. In other words, going back to Ananda's statement of how does one relinquish karma, you can only experience the old karma. You can only experience the effects of previous karma, meaning effects of previous choices, previous intentions, previous decisions, previous actions. And all of this manifests in the form of these first links of formations, consciousness, mentality, materiality, the sixfold base, contact, feeling, and the perception conjoined in that feeling. But the moment you identify or you react to the underlying tendency and have craving, then have clinging, now you're causing yourself, so to speak, new karma. So the cessation of karma is the cessation of the old karma through the non-reactivity of the experience, understanding it with mindfulness, seeing it for what it really is through the lens of the three characteristics. And therefore, if there is an arising of an underlying tendency, the mind is sharp enough with its mindfulness to be able to recognize it and let it go through the 6R processes. If it is not, then there is liability of new karma to arise because of that reactivity from lack of mindfulness, attachment, conceit, identification, and craving. So contact. Contact, as I said, is the meeting of the six sense bases with their objects. In other words, as I said, the light in the eyes, the audible sound waves with the ears, the odors with the nose, the taste with the tongue, the tangibles with the body, and so on. With this, there is an arising of the awareness of that experience. And that is the consciousness that we will experience, we'll understand at the link of consciousness when we talk about it. But contact is essentially the joining, the meeting of the physical six sense bases and their particular objects, which then gives rise to the experience, which is feeling, and then your mind, through memory, recognizes what that feeling is and adds to it the quality of pleasant, painful, neutral, and other kinds of labeling and noting of that experience. Saying, "Good friend, the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the sixfold base, the origin of the sixfold base, the cessation of the sixfold base, and the way leading to the cessation of the sixfold base, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma." And what is the sixfold base? What is the origin of the sixfold base? What is the cessation of the sixfold base? What is the way leading to the cessation of the sixfold base? There are these six bases: the eye base, the ear base, the nose base, the tongue base, the body base, and the mind base. With the arising of mentality-materiality, or nama-rupa, there is the arising of the sixfold base. With the cessation of mentality-materiality, there is the cessation of the sixfold base. The way leading to the cessation of the sixfold base is just this noble eightfold path. So the sixfold base is essentially the sense organs, the actual eye and ear and so on, and the receptors that then connect to the brain to give you some kind of an experience. But actually they are part of mentality-materiality. For the reasons of understanding dependent origination, it's divided into mentality-materiality and sixfold base, because all you experience is always through the sixfold base. So that division is there. But actually it is part of rupa. They are physical organs, so they are part of the materiality. And they can change in every given moment, because as we understand, there is a diminishing of the sense faculties. There's a diminishing of the six sense bases, dependent on the choices that one makes. I mean, for example, let's say somebody is very careless and is somebody who stares at the screen all day and has their back hunched over and things like that. Obviously their eyes will start to weaken. So the new karma is the action that you took of continually staring at the screen, not taking care of your eyes. And the old karma in the next moment, or in the next series of moments, is the old karma of a sixth sense base, specifically the eye, that is weakened. So the choices you make also influence your sixth sense bases. When a noble disciple has thus understood, When a noble disciple has thus understood the sixfold base, the origin of the sixfold base, the cessation of the sixfold base, and the way leading to the cessation of the sixfold base, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Again, saying, good friends, the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in this Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands mentality-materiality, that is to say, nama-rupa, the origin of mentality-materiality, the cessation of mentality-materiality, and the way leading to the cessation of mentality-materiality, in that way, he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is mentality-materiality? What is the origin of mentality-materiality? What is the cessation of mentality-materiality? What is the way leading to the cessation of mentality-materiality? Feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention. Sounds familiar? These are the factors in all of the jhanas, right? Feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. These are called nama or mentality. The four great elements and the material form derived from the four great elements, these are called materiality. With the arising of consciousness, there is the arising of mentality-materiality. With the cessation of consciousness, there is the cessation of mentality-materiality. The way leading to the cessation of mentality-materiality is just this noble eightfold path. So, mentality is contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. So what exactly is this? This is basically the equivalent of the five aggregates. In other words, you have the materiality, which is the form, feeling, or contact with that, which brings about feeling, perception, which is equated with perception, intention, which is equated with or equivalent to formations, because intention is the driving force for formations to carry forward, and formations are that which influence intentions in the next moment. And attention, which is the flowing or the direction in which the consciousness flows, in which the cognition flows, that is to say, consciousness or vijnana. So there is an interdependence between mentality, materiality, and consciousness. When there is the activation of the formations which activate a certain type of consciousness, that is to say vijnana, that gives rise to the color of that mindset. So another way of understanding vijnana is through the understanding of chitta or mano, which can be synonymous with vijnana. And certain tendencies in bhava can then give rise to a certain formation or certain roots, which can then give rise to a certain quality of that mindset, which can give rise to the way one perceives the nama-rupa, or cognizes the nama-rupa rather, and through which then when the contact arises, that particular consciousness that arises due to that contact colors the experience with that root, with that particular filter that the mindset has been colored with. On the other macro level, we have the understanding that the consciousness from the previous life goes and transports the formations and then activates a birth consciousness that descends into the new nama, if it's a higher realm or lower, a higher realm, like the Brahma realms and so on, or rather the formless realms, or the nama-rupa, if it's a luminous form realm or if it's a sensual realm. So I'll clarify it again. The consciousness descends either in a nama when it's in the formless realms of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, or neither perception or non-perception. But those formations or that consciousness that transports that formations can also bring about or descend into and condition a new nama-rupa, whether it's in the sensual realms or whether it's through the womb in a human birth or an animal birth or any other kind of birth within the animal realm. So the consciousness is determined by the quality of the karma, by the quality of the intention. That then deciphers, or rather descends and deciphers what kind of nama-rupa it is. As I said earlier, the formations connect with the genetic blueprint, so to speak, of the new nama-rupa, in this case, to simplify, in the human realm. And so that means that it will create a certain type of being in terms of the physicality of that being. So consciousness in that way, in the macro level, conditions the actual physical form of the being in the womb, and it conditions the contact, feeling, perception, and intention and attention because of the intention that drove forward, or the formations that drove forward that consciousness. And therefore, the way it makes contact, the way it experiences feeling, is determined by the previous consciousnesses that arise and pass away, and so on and so forth. So the arising and passing away of consciousnesses happens from the get-go in the womb itself, with the development of the fetus. When a noble disciple has thus understood mentality-materiality, the origin of mentality-materiality, the cessation of mentality-materiality, and the way leading to the cessation of mentality-materiality, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, good friend, the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. But, friend, might there be yet another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is consciousness? What is the origin of consciousness? What is the cessation of consciousness? What is the way leading to the cessation of consciousness? There are these 6 classes of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. With the arising of formations, there is the arising of consciousness. With the cessation of formations, there is the cessation of consciousness. The way leading to the cessation of consciousness is just this noble eightfold path. So here, Sāriputta is talking about consciousness in the understanding of the awareness of the experiences of the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. So as I was saying, when there is a certain activation of formations, whether they are rooted in the wholesome roots or the unwholesome roots, they will then condition the mindset, which is synonymous with the consciousness, with a certain kind of either corruption of the mind, which are the upakilesas, or with wholesome tendencies. And so then that consciousness is driven forward, influencing the nama-rupa, And then once it goes through the process of contact, that consciousness then filters the experience of the feeling. So in other words, there is, let's say, a wholesome tendency of mind, and now one is determined to send loving kindness to somebody. This is rooted in the experience of non-hatred in the formations. Now the mindset is imbued with loving kindness, and so one feels it in the nama-rupa, in the form of ease of the body and so on, or the warmth and the glow, which is another contact feeling and perception. And then you're met by somebody who maybe is not necessarily wholesome and might be rude to you. But because that rude contact, meaning the sight of that rude person and the hearing of their words, whatever arose, the contact that arises brings about the awareness. That's one understanding, the awareness of these sensory experiences. But that is also imbued or infused with loving kindness. So in other words, if you're truly with loving kindness, you will not take that rude person's comments to heart. Instead, you might forgive them, or you might just let it go and just radiate loving kindness to them. This is a very simplistic way in terms of example, so that you understand how consciousness influences contact. Consciousness first influences the elements of nama-rupa, and thereby, when arising, starts to filter the experience of feeling at the level of contact with the joining of the sense base and its object. When a noble disciple has thus understood consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" "There might be, friends." When, friends, a noble disciple understands formations, the origin of formations, the cessation of formations, and the way leading to the cessation of formations, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what are the formations? What is the origin of formations? What is the cessation of formations? What is the way leading to the cessation of formations? There are these three kinds of formations: the bodily formation, the verbal formation, the mental formation. With the arising of ignorance, there is the arising of formations. With the cessation of ignorance, there is the cessation of formations. The way leading to the cessation of formations is just this noble eightfold path. So, here Sāriputta is saying that the ignorance, that is to say the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, conditions the formations, and therefore those formations, being rooted in ignorance, will give rise to a specific consciousness that will be prone to attach itself to the experience of the feeling by its awareness. Formations, as he said, were three types: the bodily formations, which are usually related to breathing; the verbal formations, which are related to the intention to speak; and the mental formations, which provide the experience of feeling and perception. Formations also condition the intention. When you make one choice in terms of your intention, it drives forward certain formations, and then in the next cycle of intention, those formations will then condition the next intention. Unless there is a mindfulness to be able to see, I don't want this intention to be there, I'm intending this instead. And so this is what we were talking about earlier in terms of choice in that moment, where one can make a decision not to be unwholesome, but to be wholesome, or not to be identifying with the wholesome and letting go of any identification process. And as we also said, the cessation of these formations, as Sāriputta said, is the ignorance ceasing, but first the verbal formations cease when there is the second jhana, in which the vitakka and the vichara cease. There is the cessation of physical formations when the breath becomes imperceptible in the fourth jhana, and there is a complete cessation of mental formations when there is the actual cessation of perception and feeling. So formations are really the coding, if you will, of the software of the mind. It is what builds up your view of the world. It's what prepares and constructs your view of the world, which conditions and filters. It's what is the ones and zeros of the matrix that make up, because it is happening in the mind, so to speak, and whatever you are seeing is being conditioned by those formations in terms of the mental feeling and perception, in terms of the contact feeling and perception, in terms of even the intention to speak. For example, verbal formations, the way you formulate your ideas, the way you formulate your thoughts, your native language is all rooted in the verbal formations. And so that also conditions the way you interpret data in terms of what language you speak, or what language you speak in your head. Are your thoughts in a specific language when they are verbalized, for example? That also determines your intention and determines your way in which you view the world, and vice versa in terms of the feedback loop that's there. And so that feedback loop I'm talking about is the intention in nama-rupa and the formations at the lingua formations. So you see formations have a lot of feedback loops. Formations to nama-rupa, formations to feeling and perception, formations to craving, to clinging, to being, and even to the actual reaction at the birth of action. And so, as I said, on the micro level, again to repeat, just so it's understood, it's these formations that arise in the form of mental feeling and perception at the point of death or just before death. And if the mind clings to them, if the mind craves for them, if it identifies with them through some kind of reaction, then that will give rise to the consciousness that transports them to the next life. So they are the carriers of karma in that sense. They are the carriers of rebirth, or the cause of rebirth as well, in the same way. When a noble disciple has thus understood formations, the origin of formations, the cessation of formations, and the way leading to the cessation of formations, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question, "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands ignorance, the origin of ignorance, the cessation of ignorance, and the way leading to the cessation of ignorance, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is ignorance? What is the origin of ignorance? What is the cessation of ignorance? And what is the way leading to the cessation of ignorance? Not knowing about suffering, not knowing about the origin of suffering, not knowing about the cessation of suffering, not knowing about the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This is called ignorance. With the arising of the taints, there is the arising of ignorance. With the cessation of the taints, there is the cessation of ignorance. The way leading to the cessation of ignorance is just this noble eightfold path. So ignorance is on two levels. One is the intellectual level, where you don't even know anything about the Four Noble Truths. You never heard about the Four Noble Truths. And so that is one kind of ignorance. The other ignorance is truly ignoring because of lack of awareness of the Four Noble Truths. So in other words, when there's the contact, feeling, and perception, when there is the lack of mindfulness, there is the lack of mindfulness of the three characteristics of the feeling and a lack of mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths in that feeling. When that happens, that gives way or rise to the craving. So this ignorance is what needs to be eradicated. First, when you know about the Four Noble Truths for the first time, you destroy the intellectual ignorance because you have been told about the Four Noble Truths. Now it is all about the application of the Four Noble Truths, the application of the path in the Fourth Noble Truth, the understanding of the suffering or any of the links present, the letting go of the cause of those links or suffering, and experiencing the cessation of those links or the suffering. So the ignorance here fetters the formations by the process of the lack of mindfulness. In other words, in one cycle of dependent origination, when somebody sees that feeling and takes it to be myself, or takes it to be mine, and therefore acts at it with the sense of I like it, or I don't like it, or identifies with it, then the craving arises. But because of that, there has been an further strengthening of ignorance. So that feeds energy back. This is another feedback loop that goes to ignorance. Not having applied the Four Noble Truths, not having seen the Four Noble Truths, further strengthens the ignorance, which further roots that ignorance into the fetter of those formations. And the whole cycle continues yet again, unless one breaks it by having the intention of being mindful and of using the 6 R's to let go. We're almost done, I promise.
Depends on those bhikkhus, right?
Saying, good friend, the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sāriputta's words. Then they asked him a further question. But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the way leading to the cessation of the taints, in that way he is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what are the taints? What is the origin of the taints? What is the cessation of the taints? And what is the way leading to the cessation of the taints? When we say taints, we're talking about the asavas. These are like, the way to understand them is, the very subtlest is the ignorance, and beyond that is the formations. But these taints carry forward the next lifetime because of the further strengthening of formations, the further strengthening of reactions, and they feed back to a certain kind of taint, as they talk about here. There are these 3 taints: the taint of sensual desire, the taint of being, and the taint of ignorance. When one feeds the energy at the level of feeling to the underlying tendency towards craving and acts with craving, it feeds back energy to the taint of sensual desire. When one acts from bhava, with the idea of an identity, with the idea of that conceit, with the idea that this is mine, and has these automatic reactions based on that bhava, that energy of that reaction feeds back to the taint of bhava, or the taint of being. And the taint of ignorance. Whenever one acts from a lack of mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths and the 3 characteristics of existence at feeling, that feeds back energy to the taint of ignorance. And so the way to understand it, maybe through an image, is, as we said, we have the river of dependent origination, and the droplets that start off that river are the asavas. The glaciers that start that whole momentum are the asavas. You can't necessarily see them. They're more to be seen as just an effect of your previous actions and the cause, or the potential cause, of your next set of actions if you still continue to act out of sensual craving, if you still continue to act out of the sense of identity, and if you still continue to act with the lack of mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths and the 3 characteristics of existence. Now, what is the origin of the taints? It says here, with the arising of ignorance, there is the arising of the taints In other words, just as there is an interdependence between consciousness or awareness and nama-rupa, there is an interdependence between ignorance and the taints. And this is the finest, let's say, gear mechanism of the wheel of samsara. If you look at the wheel of samsara like some kind of a clock, let's say, and you have all of these different gears shifting and going depending upon your actions and reactions, the finely tuned gear that starts this whole process is this interdependency, this interaction between ignorance and the asavas. Not knowing the Four Noble Truths or not applying the Four Noble Truths further strengthens, as I said, the taints, and by doing so, it can give rise to further ignorance. The way to break that cycle is by applying the Four Noble Truths, becoming mindful of them, and using the 6R process. That is to say, the right effort.
What's the meaning of asava?
Asava is also can mean
Literally.
yeah, literally. I'm saying
I don't know the word.
yeah. Asava is ASAVA with a long vowel A. That has multiple meanings, actually, multiple connotations in Pali. It can mean the outflows or the inflows, like it's the origin of the stream, or it's the ending part of that stream, let's say. It can also mean cankers or sores, meaning it's like a wound which won't close unless you make the right effort to close it. It can also mean fermentations. That is to say, fermented drink, for example, intoxicants, because it filters this whole process of reality that you are intoxicated by this reality, by identifying with it. When you have this taint of sensual desire, you're intoxicated by the fermentation of that sensual desire. When you have the taint of being, you're intoxicated by that identity. When you have the taint of ignorance, you're intoxicated by not applying the Four Noble Truths, by the lack of mindfulness. When a noble disciple has thus understood the taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the way leading to the cessation of the taints, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to lust. So now at the level of feeling, there won't be any reactivity related to the underlying tendency to lust because it's no longer there. Nor will there be the underlying tendency to aversion, and he extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit of I am, and then therefore abandons ignorance, arouses true knowledge, and he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma and has arrived at this true Dhamma. This is what the Venerable Sāriputta said. The bhikkhus were finally satisfied and delighted in this Venerable Sāriputta's words.
This is still number 1 sutta, all
Yeah.
in number 1.
Yeah, this is Majjhima Nikaya number 9.
Oh, okay. Not Dika Nikaya.
Oh no, that was the Brahmajala Sutta I was talking about.
Dika Nikaya number 1 is out of the 62 views. This one is Majjhima Nikaya 9.
Majjhima Nikaya 9, yeah.
This is MN 9.
Yeah, Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta, or the Sutta on right view.
Which is natural because wrong view is the first thing to...
Exactly. So, I'm going to stay quiet for a while and see if anybody has any questions or comments or remarks. I mean, if you guys still have the energy to do so.
Yes, we do.
Good.
I'm worried.
Okay, can I go ahead and start off?
Yes.
So you said about formations being the code of the matrix. I just wanted to get this right. The way I understand formations is that they're already they're the code, but already, as you just said at the end, they're already tainted with something. So we're not actually even seeing the code when we're seeing the formations. We're actually seeing something
that's superimposed upon the code.
Okay.
And that superimposition on that code are the fetters of conceit, craving, and ignorance. So there's what is known as the purified formations, the pure formations of the arahant. So that means what happens with the arahant is the ignorance is destroyed. So there's no more ignorance conditioning the formations. And obviously taints are destroyed, so there's no taints conditioning the formations either. But the way the formations are activated is through the process of contact. So when the arahant's eyes meet with a color, there's a certain formation, for example, the mental formations, to feel and perceive that color, to experience and perceive that color. But beyond that, there is no craving in there. So like I said yesterday, for the arahant, there's only these links, which is the formations, the consciousness, the nama-rupa, the sixth sense space, the contact, then the feeling, and the perception conjoined with that. So when the formations are purified, then you see the entire code without the superimposition. The virus, as I like to call the asavas, are no longer infecting the code. They've gone away and it's just the pure code.
Well, there is the pure code, but there are the parameters of either wholesome or unwholesome mental factors. So we should know how the code acts depending on those parameters.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And so once you start to see that, then you start to make more wholesome intentions because they purify the code, whereas the unwholesome continues to corrupt the code. Eventually, once you have completely let go of the unwholesome, you only have the wholesome, but there's still some identity there with the conceit. Once you let go of the conceit to that, even if there are wholesome tendencies or wholesome actions, there won't be a process of identification that can cling to it to cause further renewal of the code. In other words, further rebirth.
After so many unwholesome or wrong views, it almost sounds impossible to do purification, right? But you already gave the answer that mindfulness in the 6 R's purifies immediately.
Yes.
That's almost a miracle, that only one teeny bit purifies.
Yes.
In the Abhidhamma model is that if unwholesome, but if mindfulness or metta comes with it, then you're not here, you're on the other side where the beautiful factors are. This is a kind of miracle.
And you see it in the here and now. That's the whole point of the Dhamma, that it is immediately effective.
No bookkeeping. It's no bookkeeping.
Yeah.
It's your bank account that just runs at some point. There's nothing in the bank or it's zero. And there's no bookkeeping.
Yeah. That's exactly it.
And that is also, in Buddhist philosophy, has always been troubling me. You would ask, well, where's the bookkeeper? Who's keeping track of your, kusala, akusala, the wholesome, unwholesome?
Yeah.
Where's the bank? And this clearly demonstrates or shows or is seeing that there's no bank account. Basically, it's just the result of.
Yeah.
There's only an account or whatever.
And that account is, let's say, understood through the process of formations. As I said, formations being the carriers of karma. Yeah.
So how would you see, if one can see it, the difference in a formation that is tainted and a formation that is untainted?
Yeah.
You're saying then you see the code, but that sounds all over.
Yeah, but based on
how does it look?
Based on the intention.
Right.
Because it's the intention that is conditioned by the formations and further conditions the formations. So if the intention is wholesome, then you know there have arisen wholesome formations. If the intention is unwholesome, then you know there have arisen unwholesome formations.
So they're sort of, let's say, colored.
That's right. That's right.
from a certain perspective, let's say.
Right.
So you talked about the rebirth on a micro level in terms of new physical birth. Would it be fair to say that the consciousness which connects itself to the fertilized act will basically use the intention, full nama-rupa and the formations to start that being, but to continue the full flow of samsara? In other words, would this intentionalize the way the act is going to grow in terms of how the being is going to be, etc., including the six sense bases?
Yes, yes. Because in the same way, on the micro level, as I said, if you make certain choices that can harm your six sense bases, then that's the effect of those choices. But on the macro level, as I said, the formations connect with the genetic blueprint, which in turn means that the genetic blueprint is what is programming how the being is going to grow, how the being is going to function, and certain choices activate certain gene expressions, and certain choices deactivate certain gene expressions. So even within the womb, the transformation of the fetus into whatever that being is going to become is determined by the formations, or the karma that is carried by the formations.
So then the immediate effect is that the awareness is on a moment-by-moment basis because it's dependent on all the factors.
Yes.
But the flow is continuous.
Yes.
In other words, there's a spontaneous rebirth.
Yes. In every moment. Yeah.
In every moment.
That's right.
So there's no difference between this moment and the moment of passing away and getting a rebirth.
You mean within the womb?
No, what I mean is the current moment, in terms of a being is alive, the next moment is actually the same thing as at a moment of passing away and still having ignorance, still having the things.
Yes.
And the physical rebirth, where consciousness attaches itself to a new nama-rupa in womb.
Yes. Yes. So, in other words, one way of understanding it is, at that point, the fetus in the womb has nothing to do, cannot do anything in terms of being able to learn the Dhamma. And so its formations are just being activated dependent upon the ignorance. But it can still make choices insofar as it can feel what's going on in the womb, for example. It can feel like it's comfortable in the womb or whatever it might be, and becomes attached to that experience for the next 9-10 months. And hence when it comes out, it cries and feels like, where am I? What's going on in this cold world, you know?
So this explains very well the pivotal role of mindfulness and letting go.
Yeah.
It doesn't yet explain why realization is possible. And Buddhaghosa says something that's useful here. And he says that dukkha is the nausea for emptiness. Emptiness in the sense of lack of self. There is this basic, we need self. Because we need something to go to the bakery to buy a bread, we need a hold. And the realization is finding another hold than the self.
Yes, yes. So what we have been exploring really is the arising of the second noble truth. There is, I think we're pretty good for now, but I was intending to, but we'll see maybe another time. But there is a video on YouTube about it, which is the transcendental dependent origination, or as I like to call it, dependent cessation, which deals with the realization. How does the realization arise? First, it starts with suffering. then it gets into faith or conviction, and in some cases it's also the maintaining of sila, which then gives rise to pamoja, which is the self-confidence and the happiness of being in the Dhamma. That gives rise to the joy, that gives rise to the tranquility, and then the collectedness, and then other steps that lead to the realization, and so on.
And what sutta is that?
That is Samyutta Nikaya 12.23, and that is known as the Upanisa Sutta.
Thank you.
Welcome. So,
Okay, I make a wholesome intention. This creates, I'm guessing, a pure formation. Let's say one pure formation. Is that pure formation still tainted by underlying tendencies, or is it really pure?
that depends on whether there is any conceit present in there. So that means there can still be a wholesome formation, it can still be somewhat purified, but if there's still some pride in the in the wholesome action, then it can still fetter that formation with conceit of I am, and hence also ignorance.
Okay, so you could say, simplified, that if there is no conceit present in that wholesome intention, it's like a piggy bank of collecting, creating, I mean they are always in flux, but creating truly pure formations.
Right, but it's a dissipation of those formations. They're not necessarily collected. So once the formations are purified completely, in the case of the arahant, then it's just a dissipation of karma. That's why we're talking about the distinction between old karma and new karma, where the pure formations are part of the old karma. And because there's no reactivity, there's no further strengthening of the old formations. Rather, they're just being spent, if you will.
There's no one to make an intention to do a wholesome thing.
Yeah, well, the intention there is just observed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a goofy conceit already. Like,
Yeah.
I want to do something good. Nah, no way.
Yeah.
That's not happening. Yeah, 'cause that,
But it's a step-by-step process. It's like a 3-step ladder. You go from the wholesome, you go from the unwholesome to the wholesome, then wholesome to detachment from the identification with the unwholesome.
Small remark to Marco. You say, where is the bookkeeping? When you have bitcoins and blockchain, then all the bookkeeping is in the one item that you send. So,
yeah, but then the child would ask, where's that?
but then
The child would ask, oh, but where's that?
no, but you compromise.
I
And
understand.
actually the brain or the body, mind, brain does something like that. How it does is not known yet fully. So.
Well, I would say that storage system, as I said, is the formations. In other words, if you want to access rebirths or you want to access previous births, it's through the formations. That's why we were talking about how in neither perception, non-perception, with the arising of certain formations, if one goes to a certain line of thinking with those formations, they start to access certain previous lives because they are carrying the coding or the information from those previous lives. They're the storage media, the storage device. And then, of course, if you do it on an intentional level where you make it an entire practice, like the threefold knowledge from the base of the fourth jhana, what you're doing is by using the process of remembering what happened in a previous moment, you're activating, or rather accessing, the database of formations rooted in that memory. So the storage media is really the formations, and the formations can be equated, as I said, to on the genetic level, the gene expression, and on the neuroscientific level, the synapses, which are always either being pruned depending upon your choice. This is the neuroplasticity that we talk about, which is to say that when you make a certain choice, certain synapses are further strengthened. And so it's the same way when you're strengthening further formations. But when you weaken the unwholesome, You're pruning away at them, you're weakening them, you're cutting away at them, and there is a remainderless fading away of them. They no longer function anymore.
So Delson gave a beautiful answer to the question you asked me.
Well, it's all right.
Okay, I have a question now that you touched on past lives. So I wanted to ask you first two questions just to get my understanding correctly. So the linking between nama-rupa and consciousness is such that consciousness can actually leave at certain moments, come back, in the sense, for instance, if you're at your deathbed and you're seeing an image of a fetus, or you're imagining yourself as a fetus, so this is the first question, could we say that your consciousness is actually going into that new nama-rupa or not?
Not at that point. It won't happen before death.
Okay, it won't happen before death at any point.
No.
Okay.
It will only happen at the point of death. What is happening in that process is certain things come up in terms of whether they're images or memories or things like that. And the reaction to those memories or to those images activates the formations. Then that activates the death consciousness that transports the formations into the new fetus.
Okay. It's basically a file that Google collects, let's say, of all your searches, basically, and all your attempts.
Yeah. And the most number of searches that you have is the one that it...
Yeah. And then you do a gap and you see like 3 gigs in your file, and you're like, whoa, and they'll take it and, to the next whatever.
Yes.
Upload, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And how, just out of curiosity, so some traditions say that it's not only your reactions to your life experience, but also you experience the reactions of all the others you did it to. So now we're connecting files. Now we're going with blockchain and analogy here. So how would that work then?
So,
if they
yeah. I mean, that goes back to the understanding of karma, which is to say that either in that same lifetime or in that same moment, for example, somebody's having an argument or something and somebody says something negative to somebody. The immediate reaction is somebody returning that negative comment with another negative comment. And so you feel the same pain inflicted upon you that you inflicted upon them. That's one understanding. But it can happen through the process of multiple lifetimes. You might not experience the effect of that action until maybe a lifetime later or 1,000 lifetimes later, possibly.
Right. But it's still stored in that, let's say,
Yes.
moment file.
Yes. It's the snapshot of that. And then it becomes activated.
Some people see it as sort of also, these small frame, when they zoom in, zoom in.
Yeah. You had a second question, right?
No, my second question was, because this is something I read in Bhikkhu Nanananda's book, and it really ticked me off. He talked about a near-death experience in which you see yourself from outside.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's called right now. And he was saying that, yes, consciousness was up there, but since there was no nama-rupa in which it could store itself, the consciousness would come back to the body.
Yeah.
But I'm not really sure how that could work, in the sense that if there is no container, it doesn't make sense that the nama-rupa is actually up there, but that maybe it's just mind consciousness.
It's mind consciousness. That's exactly it. Yeah.
So that was my...
Yeah. So these near-death experiences you have, like an out-of-body experience or things like that, they're happening on the mind-made body level.
Yes.
So the formations that are arising based on that experience then will determine if there's craving for them, if there's going to be another rebirth or not, and what kind of rebirth it will be.
Okay. So that's it. It was actually, if you answered positively to those 2 questions, I was going to ask you a series of questions on possible ways in which consciousness just leaves and comes back. But it's better that you answered negatively.
Yeah. It is all happening in the mind-made body, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's that wouldn't be the answer I was expecting, because it just seems way too complicated, and it doesn't seem.
It doesn't match with the Dhamma, actually.
Yes, it doesn't match with the 12-link formula.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That's it.
Shall we share that?
May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.